So again, welcome everyone to our Black History Month edition of Virtual Learning at Lunch. For those of you who haven't met me, I am Dr. Justin Pariseau. I'm an associate professor of history here at Prairie State College. I am also the chair of the Social Sciences Department and coordinator of African and African American Studies here at the college. And if you have any questions about our African and African American Studies program, I'd be happy to stay after the session to talk to you if you're interested in taking any of our general education courses in that program. I'm very excited about our conversation today, focusing on African American mariners in early Virginia. So we'll be getting to that part of the conversation in just a moment. Please note, I do have in the chat some additional resources if you're interested in the subject matter today that you can follow up on. There are some suggested readings, the encyclopedia article that's the basis for this conversation today, as well as a book by author W. Jeffrey Bolster, Blackjacks, African American Seamen in the Age of Sail, which is really one of the major go-to sources on this subject, as well as some upcoming programs here at the college during Black History Month. Our African American Read-In, which is coming up on Wednesday, February 23rd at 1 o'clock. The Google Meet link is there in the chat. And later this month on Monday, February 28th, we have our Prairie State College Library featuring The Hate You Give for this month's book club meeting. So if you're interested in attending any of those events, the information can be found there. If you give me a moment, I'm going to present my screen here. And hopefully this will work. So everybody should be able to see the opening screen here. Lalinda, if you could give me a thumbs up if you're able to see the Black History Month PowerPoint opening slide here.
I can sort of see it, but maybe this is just me. Oh, nope, there it is. Yep, everything's good now.
Everything's good? All right. Hopefully it's not shaded here. Is it visible or? Okay.
It's very clear on my end, Jason.
Very clear. Okay, thanks, Brianna. I appreciate it. I'm trying something different here. Probably should have tested it out first. So just a little bit of background on this project that I've been working on for a little while. It took some time to get this all together, in large part because of the pandemic and doing the research virtually. A few years ago, the Encyclopedia of Virginia, which is a project that's been undertaken by the Library of Virginia and in partnership with the University of Virginia and Virginia Humanities, which is tied to the National Endowment for the Humanities. They were interested in diversifying their encyclopedia offerings. And as I'm sure you can guess, one of the issues relating to the recording of history in Virginia, really even up until very recently, was a very narrow focus on certain stories that have traditionally been emphasized, with a lack of emphasis on the contributions of Black Virginians to Virginia's history. So the encyclopedia was a wonderful resource on a number of topics, a range of topics. They just did not have all that much information about African American contributions to Virginia history, and in particular, early Virginia history, which is really at odds with the reality of life in Virginia from its founding all the way up to the present. So they reached out. They were interested in having me do some work on this, in large part due to the fact that they had first contacted my dissertation advisor, Professor Mel Ely at William and Mary, and he wrote this book, Israel on the Appomattox, which focused in part on Black watermen and boatmen on the James River during the 19th century. So they kind of thought he was a natural person to reach out to. And he was fortunately for me, busy, wasn't able to do the research to work on this. So he told them to reach out to me because I had worked on African-American whalemen in New Bedford and Nantucket. So I wanted to take up the project, and it turned into kind of an interesting process for me. Historians do their work in archives, and being where I am in Chicago Heights, Illinois, it's hard to do that research in archives in Virginia. So I had to do a lot of work virtually, and a lot of that detective work that I had to do had to be done reading between the lines of a lot of really challenging documents. Going back and forth with one of the editors for Encyclopedia of Virginia, they were interested in, and I certainly was interested in, finding more African-American voices to be able to tell their own stories. I was really clear with them from the very beginning that I was skeptical that we were going to find much, just because of my past experience doing research in kind of a parallel area of maritime research, looking at Black mariners in New England. They just did not leave a lot of evidence behind, a lot of information behind. And sometimes that's for really good reason. And we'll get into that as we talk about some of the examples that came out of the research that I did. But I was feeling a little bit more confident that if I looked at other source material, I might be able to get at those stories that I really wanted to tell, the stories of the Black mariners, by looking at the evidence through a different lens. So one example of that is this watercolor that appears in the records of Benjamin Henry Latrobe. He's the designer of the U.S. Capitol building. And in his spare time, he kept some journals that were beautifully illustrated, as you can see here. This is an image of three Black watermen, or bateaumen. The bateau is the name of the boat that they were using on the James River during the early American period. And he was essentially looking at life in Virginia through an outsider's kind of perspective. And one of the things that we'll see on the next screen here is his description of the men that you see in that watercolor. He described them in this way. He said each bateau is managed by three men who with great dexterity often carry them 30 miles against the stream in one day. Now that doesn't sound like it's all that much work to do, or that it's that difficult to do, but even just from looking at the watercolor, you can get a sense of what the wave action is like on the James River above the falls. I mean, this is not easy water to navigate. It's actually pretty difficult to do. If we look at the image here, in particular, the way that they're navigating the water, they're not rowing. They're not, if you've ever used a canoe or a rowboat, they're not using oars. They're pulling the river. They're pulling the boat up the river. So you're having to push against the current in a lot of cases, carrying heavy loads, tobacco, coal, all kinds of other commodities that are making their way up and down the river. Northern communities are building more canals to be able to use those waterways to be able to get commerce from one place to another. But in the case of Virginia, there's something like 50,000 miles of river in Virginia. So it only makes sense to use the existing waterways to be able to transport goods from one place to another. And because of the difficulty of the work, oftentimes what we find in the historical record is that it's the enslaved African Americans and free African Americans who are within the Virginia community who are doing this labor. So if we go to the records of white journalists and diarists and go through the newspapers and go to the runaway ads in particular, we're able to find evidence of their contributions to the Virginia economy and evidence of what their lives were like as they were doing this work. Another example of ways we can kind of read between the lines of the surviving evidence to really see how embedded African Americans were in the early Virginia economy is to look at the archaeological evidence. And this is an image from the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, of course, being the plantation owned and operated by George Washington, where they're finding thousands of bones of catfish and other freshwater fish in the evidence. And there are any number of reasons that this might be the case. If we look at just an excerpt from the article that I wrote, Washington pretty frequently in his diary actually talks about the enslaved individuals on his plantation that he's forcing to do this work of fishing, of setting the nets, maintaining the nets, hauling in the fish, barreling them, pickling them, getting them ready for not just domestic consumption, not for feeding people who are living on the plantation, but shipping this stuff internationally. And it boosts the profit margins for Washington to do this. He has a number of enterprises that he's engaged in, a distillery that he gets going over the course of his latter years at Mount Vernon. This operation is one of his most profitable early ventures. And of course, what initially gets lost in the mix as we look at the way that these stories are told for a long period of time, people talk about George Washington's innovations. They talk about how effective he was at operating the plantation and how he made it profitable. And when we actually look at who makes this profitable, when we take a closer look at who is making Mount Vernon operate, it's the individuals that he names in his diary, that he names in his journal, that are doing this work, making all of those profits for Washington and facilitating Washington's rise to power. Washington has the leisure to be able to run for the House of Burgesses in Virginia. He has the ability to sit at the Second Continental Congress, because of these individuals who he owns as property, the enslaved individuals at Mount Vernon who are facilitating his financial success, which facilitates his public success as a key figure. So we're looking at American history, or taking a deeper dive into something like this and looking at Virginia history, for far too long, as I'm sure you're all aware, the contributions of these individuals who are really hidden in the pages of the historical record, the primary sources, they're there to be found, but you've really got to dig to be able to find them and find out how key they are to that economy. Another example of this, getting beyond the descriptions that Washington and visitors to Mount Vernon provide, which provided the basis for a lot of the research that I was able to find on contributions of Black watermen early on in Virginia's history. We've also got the Chesapeake Bay to look at. And this image from 1872, after the American Civil War, provides another example of how central Black Virginians were to the maritime economy of Virginia itself. And this is an image of Black oystermen harvesting oysters. Oysters are, kind of a luxury product, especially here in the Midwest. You have to pay a lot of money to find, good quality oysters, easier to come by in Virginia, New England, wherever you might be closer to the Atlantic coast. But very central to Virginia's kind of self-identity, or the idea of these independent watermen working the waterways of Virginia, bringing in these harvests. And you can see that at play here. It's a little bit hard to make out, I'm sure, because of the size of the screen, but it's a fairly detailed engraving showing how central African Americans were to this work. Before the Civil War, would have been a mix of enslaved individuals and free African Americans who gained their freedom at various points throughout Virginia's history prior to the Civil War, whether it be self-emancipation, whether it be because of actions taken during the American Revolution where they gained their freedom, whether it be because of acts of the General Assembly after the war itself. But again, complicating the narrative of the history of Virginia prior to the Civil War is the fact that there are many free individuals who happen to be African American, who are part of this economy, working side by side with enslaved individuals too. By this point, obviously by 1872, during Reconstruction, all of these individuals would have been free. And using this work to try to make a life for themselves out within the very difficult constraints of Reconstruction era Virginia and the challenges that these free people faced in the post-Civil War era. Because it's one thing to be free and emancipated, but to be equal, those are two very different things. And it's something that these individuals would have had a little bit more access to in terms of greater equality, because they had more independence. They had the ability to sell their catches and to be outside of the constraints of the Virginia economy that many of their fellow Black compatriots would have been facing on the mainland. The challenges the sharecroppers would have been facing, for example, these individuals didn't face those challenges, and it was a different pathway to freedom for them. To look at some other examples of pathways to freedom during the pre-Civil War era, another great area of source material that I found and something I've worked with a lot in other contexts was to look at runaway ads, people who were seeking self-emancipation, enslaved individuals who took it upon themselves to basically not wait to be free, but to free themselves from their enslavers. And one of the best pathways for them to achieve that is via the water. They're able to have a pathway that brings them to the free North in the post-Revolutionary War era. They're able to cast themselves as free people, even though somebody might still try to claim them as their enslaved property. If you're able to take on the dress of a mariner, if you're able to dress up as a seaman, you're able to cast yourself as a free person and maybe buy yourself enough time to be able to make good on the promise of freedom to get away from Virginia for good. And you can see that here towards the end. One of the articles that I found in the Virginia Gazette from January 1768, this individual named Tom, he's being sought. And the fear here is that, basically he belongs to a person who had employed African Americans as skippers of vessels, so as captains, people in charge, people with great responsibility of property and the safety of the crew. So quite a bit of responsibility being given to somebody who, in another context in Virginia, ultimately would not have been given the same kinds of opportunities. In this case, Tom uses this opportunity to make good on his attempt to be free, and tries to pass himself off, as it's described here, to endeavor to pass for a freeman. Tom certainly sees himself as a free person and is able to, hopefully, we don't know for sure because there wouldn't be a way to really verify this, but odds are if they're able to make it away, as these individuals did, described by William Still in the Underground Railroad. If you can make it to Philadelphia, you've got access to New York. You can make it further north, even as far as Massachusetts, and potentially make it away for good. And if you're thinking the William Still name sounds familiar, if you're familiar with the story of Harriet Tubman, if you've seen the movie Harriet, that's the William Still of that film. There's a few things made up in that movie, but ultimately the William Still character is fairly accurate. So he was one thing we find after the Civil War. The abolitionists, like William Still, are trying to record what they did, what they accomplished for posterity. And this wonderful engraving helps to kind of flesh out that story of people who were able to make their way to freedom. One of the other images that I wanted to share with you today, and I'll wrap it up here in a couple of moments, so give you a chance to ask questions and we can perhaps talk about some of this too, is this portrait of a sailor that I often share with students. And I'm sure you can imagine, for good reason, it is a huge counter narrative to other images that we see from the 19th century. And for someone like me who studies maritime history, it's not outside the norm of what we see, in terms of the opportunities that African Americans had during the 1800s to have a chance to make a life for themselves off the coast in a profession, to be able to make money, to be able to support a family, to be able to build a community. In a lot of cases in the North, that's what supports the free African American communities there. The mariners who are at sea, coming back every few years, putting down roots, starting families, starting businesses, investing, doing all the things that we think to talk about a lot later in early American history, but that really becomes part of the early American narrative if we're looking at what people were actually doing in the lead up to the American Civil War. Not to mention the fact that this is clearly a self-assured person who knows his worth and really represents, as we look through other examples of primary source material, particularly the documents that are generated by white enslavers who are trying to continue the narratives of racism during the 19th century. This runs completely counter to those tropes and narratives that they're putting forward to try to keep white supremacy going as much as they can. And, it's one of the things that I love about this image, that we see him in the blue jacket with the red cravat that's described in so many of these runaway ads, where they're fearful that this man's going to get on a ship and we're never going to see him again because he's passing himself off as a sailor and making his way to freedom. And I love that this image is on display at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art right now as part of a larger showing of Black portraiture that takes us from early America up to the present day, as you can get a snapshot of here from this image that I took from their website. It's just a remarkable showing of Black portraiture over a long period of time that I think really sets this portrait in its proper context. And then the last image I'll share with you here, kind of jumping from the early Republic period to the Civil War. The Black sailor in uniform that we picked for the materials that we used to get information out about this program today. I don't like to throw a lot of numbers out, but I think this one really deserves to be mentioned, that we know of 18,000 Black Americans who joined the U.S. Navy during the Civil War, 2,822 of whom were born in Virginia, which, of course, as you know, fought for the Confederacy. Which means that 16%, 16% of enlisted Black sailors served out of Virginia, and that's more than any other state. So when we think about history, we often think of people as being acted upon, and it's not that at all. When we think about this period of American history, we have to reframe the context as a story of power, not of agency, of people who are taking matters into their own hands. They're not waiting around for somebody to do something to help them. They're doing things to help themselves. And in particular with Black sailors during this era, they are a shining example to other people of what can be accomplished and the possibilities for freedom that exist during the late 18th and early 19th century. And it's not to say that there aren't other things happening during this era that are important for us to talk about. The kind of key figures that we usually focus on who played a role in emancipation and the abolition of slavery, they still deserve to be part of that narrative. But I would argue and submit that looking into this research and looking at the stories of early Black Americans, like the image of the sailor I showed you, like this one of a Black sailor who fought during the American Civil War to end the Confederacy, they're an important part of that narrative too. And if we look at the kind of work that they were doing, just to achieve freedom as of 1865, that's not enough. The economy that they built that survives the Civil War continues to provide them with opportunities after the American Civil War and enables these individuals to thrive for a long time after the war comes to a conclusion, even when other people might be struggling amidst white supremacy and racism that we know exists after the Civil War comes to an end. So I'm going to stop sharing the presentation here. This will cooperate. Go back to the larger view here so I can see everybody. So I've got a couple of minutes here before I have to let you all go, but does anybody have any questions or comments, ideas that they'd like to share? Be happy to hear from anybody if you're interested in jumping in.
Justin, this is quite a counter intuitive, so to speak, of what you think of. I mean, I'm thinking of the movies that I've watched and the terrible conditions, and I see that sailor that you showed who is an astute person, you know, an astute standing man. However, boy, does that contrast with whatever Amistad or whatever some of these things that we've seen during those periods. So I have to get my head around it, I guess.
Yeah, you know, one thing that I think is interesting about the image of the sailor, it tracks with what we see happening in the early 1800s in South Carolina. They ended up passing a series of acts that actually target Black sailors, that free Black sailors who sail into South Carolina ports are actually jailed during the time that they're in like Charleston. And the reason is that they're fearful that you have a free African-American sailor walking around on the dock and you have an enslaved dock worker who's there who sees that person, the whole system crumbles. You know, the whole system falls apart, you know, and just the image of that person is a threat. You know, as much as a pamphlet that, you know, like David Walker's appeal, which is calling for a violent overthrow of slavery. You know, the image of a person in a sailor's uniform who has money in his pocket and autonomy and power, that's just devastating to, you know, white supremacists who are trying to stop the spread of these ideas. So yeah, I agree with you. It's a really striking image.
Thank you.
Other thoughts?
Hi, Justin.
Hi.
You used a lot of great imagery and art in your presentation. I'm wondering what suggestions that you have for just locations online where you can find this type of historical imagery. Because I find I often kind of look around and I don't really find what I need to find. And I think obviously asking the historian would probably be a good place to start. So.
No, it's a good question. I've always had good luck with Library of Congress. They're always a good go-to source. You know, Mystic Seaport is pretty good for, you know, they style themselves the Museum of America and the Sea. So they've got that market cornered, but you know, in terms of these kinds of images, they are few and far between. I don't want to give people too much hope of finding more images like this. There's a bunch that I could point you to that help to kind of flesh this out a little bit. But in terms of, you know, these kinds of pictures and portraits, they're coming more to light now as people are kind of crowdsourcing the information. It's a really exciting time for doing this kind of research because there are a lot of people who are transcribing documents, and I think coming across more of these images as time goes by. And because of the digital age, I mean, I can see before we go if I can find that exhibition out in Los Angeles. I'll put the link so you can take a look. I was personally surprised that this portrait in particular, which everyone uses. I mean, if you're going to do a book on free African American sailors, I mean, Bolster put him right on the front of his book. So it's the go-to source for people using that kind of image. But it ended up in LA, which was kind of surprising to me. I would have expected it to be East Coast, so somebody might have brought it with them. There's this example of scrimshaw at Library of what was it? Chicago History Museum. There's a example of scrimshaw, a whale's tooth, if you're not familiar, that's carved with a black soldier that dates to 1861 to 1865. And we don't know who made it because a lot of this art's anonymous. The man in that portrait that I showed you, we don't know who he is. Some people have speculated it's Paul Cuffey. I don't know if we have enough information to nail that down definitively, but this whale's tooth that's carved with a black soldier on it is just really fascinating, because we can reasonably assume that a white sailor is not going to take that up as a subject during the 19th century. It's probably one of the 30 to 40% of African American sailors who were serving on board one of these whale ships that carved that image. So it's the information's out there, the images are there. It just takes a lot of digging. And aside from Library of Congress, I would say look at a lot of these maritime museums, because they're usually better than most at trying to preserve this information. Ashonda, you had your hand up as well.
I do have a question. First, thank you for telling me about this whale's tooth thing. I just Googled that. I'm amazed. I didn't even know that was a thing. So art.
Yeah, Scrimshaw is awesome.
But also, I wanted to find out, it looks like those images may have been produced after Emancipation Proclamation. So would those people, those soldiers in the images have been like indentured servants or something that they were still working? I know you mentioned they're possibly working for themselves, but likely not.
So, so a couple of things. The image of the painting of the anonymous Black Mariner, that is dated roughly to 1800. So it's been speculated that he's free, but there is a possibility he could have been enslaved. The image of the Black sailor who served presumably in the U.S. Navy, off the top of my head, I think it was done in Cincinnati, and it was. I'd have to double check. I could get back to you with the date on it, Ashonda, because that might narrow it down a little bit. But it's used as kind of a stand-in for Black sailors more broadly, because they're, again, compared to their white counterparts, there aren't as many of those images that are extant that survive. And it makes sense that that would be the case, because they're having to pay for them. So if you're looking at, somebody who's got a little bit more coin in their pocket who could pay for that carte de vis to be made, then, we're going to have that image that survives. People like Frederick Douglass had tons of portraits done of themselves, and he does that purposefully because he's trying to, contradict narratives that existed of Black Americans, via that visual record. But in the case of this individual, I threw out that number about 2,822 Virginians who are fighting. They really locked down emancipation after the first 10 years or so of their early republic. Once the transatlantic slave trade comes to a close, they pretty much put a stop to emancipation because they don't want the system to crumble. So we can assume that most of those individuals who fought in the U.S. Navy are going to be enslaved. When after the war, when some of them are able to get those portraits done, they've got their old uniforms, they could put them back on, they could have that done. And if you look at that picture, there's a painted backdrop that's there that they're using. So it's kind of like for those of you who are old enough like me to remember going to like Sears or JCPenney or something and getting the portraits done, they've got the pull down that they did. It's similar to that. And I think there's any number of reasons why somebody would want to have that done. I mean, just to record their service and to have a memento of that to share with family because of their pride of what they had accomplished. That's one of the sources I think we see of more of those images being generated. But they're really remarkable because, again, when we look at 18,000 Black Americans who are fighting in the U.S. Navy, we spend a lot of our time looking at the 54th Massachusetts and, their accomplishments, and they get a movie. I want to see the movie about the Black sailors who helped to win the war. So if we have any students or, budding cinematographers or producers, there's a gap there. So definitely an avenue of exploration to help get that story out. And even when you look at images of the USS Monitor, the Battle of the Ironclads that took place, this seminal moment in American naval history and global naval history, some of the images that are done after the battle where you can see cannonball dents in the Monitor's turret after CSS Virginia attacked it, there are Black sailors right in the foreground. So again, I think anytime, someone talks about American history and leaves out Black Americans, they're fundamentally missing the point of our shared history. And these are some of the really great examples that you can point people to. Charmaine, you said you wanted to share, your grandmother had always said to you, quote, "There is power in how you present yourself, even when you say nothing," just reflecting on the comment of the slave owners being fearful of other enslaved people seeing people. Yeah, I absolutely agree with you 100%, Charmaine. I think, when we look at the power of those images, sometimes students will ask me, they've seen lots of pictures of Frederick Douglass. I have that one daguerreotype on my office door, where, he's a very young man. And, we've got those images of him as the elder statesman too. And, some people are like, "Oh, he must have been doing selfies, or he's really vain or whatever." And I'm like, no, that's not what he's doing. He's out there trying to, very quietly, it sounds like, as your grandmother said, to put that counter narrative out there. And I think that's a really powerful part of his advocacy that goes beyond, his eloquence of his writing. He does something too when he gets in front of that photographer that's really important. So thanks for sharing that, Charmaine. I appreciate that. Other thoughts, comments, ideas? All right. Well, I wanted to say thank you all for taking time out of your day to join me for part of your lunch and for this lunch and learn. I'm going to stop recording here, but just to mention ever so briefly, for those of you who might be watching later, in the chat, I don't know that you'll have access to it, but please join us later this month for Prairie State College's African American Read-In on Wednesday, February 23rd at 1 p.m. The Google Meet link will be available in the event calendar and some of the other promotional materials that have gone out. Also later this month, the Prairie State College Library is hosting a book club meeting of The Hate U Give, and that will be on Monday, February 28th, starting at noon, also virtually via Google Meet. So again, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate you being here or watching this later, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.